Hello, everyone. I'm Cristian Marroquin, and I'm a computer science major here at Miracosta. For my presentation, I wanted to talk about the current political climate we're witnessing from within a pandemic. I was able to tie this interest in with my American history class by researching and analyzing the voting process and struggles minorities in America have faced in the past, as in comparison with current tactics of voter suppression. Despite currently having the most open election laws in American history, some citizens still feel that their vote is suppressed or has no tangible influence on elections, and others just simply opt out from voting altogether. My first question is, how was voting originally implemented and what constituted change? In order to comprehend the current legislation surrounding voting and how it came about, we need to start it from the beginning at the Reconstruction Era. The Reconstruction Era was the period following the American Civil War as the federal government dictated the reformation necessary for former Confederate states. That point in time was a fundamental part for American voter rights as it was the first time the federal government stepped in to provide recently liberated slaves the right to vote. The 14th and 15th Amendment gave citizenship and protections from discriminatory legislation and guaranteed Black men the right to vote, respectively. Instead of empowering Black men to vote, these bills received backlash as people could openly discriminate as the protections only applied to state-sanctioned discrimination. This push for equality amongst all citizens birthed discriminatory practices such as separate but equal policies and other forms of segregation that came to be known as the Jim Crow era. This era in American history not only made voting more difficult for Black Americans, it also made life more difficult as states maneuvered around the 14th and 15th Amendment by enacting tactics of voter suppression to maintain the status quo, similar to slavery, due to the lack of representation of Black Americans and even forced labor due to criminal activities. My next question is, what forms of voter suppression did minorities face nationally? Before the era of Jim Crow, the oldest relic for controlling the turnout of presidential elections was and still is the Electoral College. In a democracy, elected leaders are a fundamental aspect in empowering citizens, but deciding between elections held by current Congress members and elections held by the citizens known as the popular vote was debated profusely. Both had their pros and cons, such as elected Congress members voting against the interest of their respective states and districts versus the popular vote where bigger states could overpower the influence of smaller states due to the difference in population densities. The constitutional framers decided to bridge a gap between the options in order to minimize any negative repercussions. The Electoral College is the outcome, and this is the process that effectively elects the president by using a group of state electors corresponding to the size of state representatives and senators. 2 months after the presidential elections in November, chosen electors cast their votes for the winning candidate of their state and consequently give the state to that candidate, expecting to coincide with the popular vote. The issues with the Electoral College is that it simply promotes the same issues it was meant to dispute. Way back at the Electoral College's inception, the issue with simply going by the popular vote was that there were only 13 states, traveling wasn't as simple as it is in contemporary America, and small voter turnout due to white landowning men being able to vote. Without the Electoral College, the most populated and wealthy states would be deciding the nation's trajectory. In contemporary America, voter turnout is far greater and more diverse as traveling is commercially available, so it is no longer the hardship it once was. Presidential candidates are also very aware of the true importance of the Electoral College and actively pursue electors through swing states while easing up on safe states of the opposing party instead of campaigning equally to all citizens. Lastly, it enforces a rigid binary political system that misinforms people politically by effectively shutting out any other political perspective with the winner-takes-all approach of electors in some states. The Electoral College also dissuades minorities like conservatives in California and liberals in Kentucky from voting as it nullifies their votes, even if their chosen candidate went on to win the popular vote. The Constitution has a vague interpretation of the Electoral College, which has left open an opportunity for faithless electors to cast their own vote, contrary to the popular vote in some states. Another form of suppressing voters and popular legislation is through the use of the filibuster. In order to understand the negative impacts it has on voters, we need to analyze its history and background, especially since this is a relatively new implementation. Before the filibuster was enacted in its current capacity, the motion previous question was used by the House and Senate as far back as 1789. Although rarely used prior, the previous question motion was a way to bring an end to debate for an immediate vote. This came to an end in 1806 after Vice President Burr recommended revisions to the Senate rulebook by removing unnecessary and unused rules such as the previous question. As time progressed, the previous question motion became a powerful tool in the House of Representatives in ending prolonged debate. Meanwhile, the Senate gave way to the talking filibuster. This filibuster was mostly used for blocking civil rights legislations. For example, Senators Richard Russell, Strom Thurmond, Robert Byrd, William Fulbright, and Sam Ervin stalled the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 for 2 months to prevent federal protections against discriminations based on one's race, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, and nationality. Current filibuster reforms make it easier to stall and derail popular legislation, as now senators don't actually need to hold the floor, as they can simply impose or threaten a filibuster. In 1917, the Senate adopted the cloture rule in order to end a filibuster that required a 2/3 majority vote, but now it's only 3/5 or 60 of the 100 senators. Aside from the cloture, there are few exceptions for certain financial issues to avoid the filibuster, but this aside, the majority rule is required to end a vote, which allows endless bickering dependent upon the political spread amongst the senators. My final research question is, why do some states change their voter process and how does it occur? To analyze the motives between state-only voter reform and the repercussions it has on voters, I will be focusing on the state of Georgia and its most recent voter reform from 2013 to the present. The state of Georgia is one of the former Confederacy states that had federal supervision over its readmittance into the Union, such as ratifying new amendments into state law. The 15th Amendment was meant to inhibit discriminatory behaviors of what would become the Jim Crow, but instead of promoting voter turnout amongst minorities, individuals of the state would enact voter reforms such as poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and even direct calls of violence by white Americans. This came to an end in 1965 following the cloture vote of the filibuster delaying the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act granted everyone the right to vote regardless of their race, religion, sexual orientation, and gender identity. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 also has certain stipulations for former Confederacy states requiring new federal supervision on all state voter reform. This worked as intended, lowering voter discrimination, but this came to an end in 2013 as Alabama ended up before the Supreme Court arguing that it was unconstitutional and outdated to simply hold some states to a higher degree. In Shelby County versus Holder, instead of holding the requirement or raising the standard for the whole nation as well, the landmark decision ended federal accountability on state voter reform. Meanwhile, in Georgia, prior to and while running for the gubernatorial election, Brian Kemp was the Secretary of State, which gave him access over voter reform implementation. Following the outcomes of Shelby County versus Holder, Georgia had used its newfound freedom to actually implement more restrictive voter reform. One form of voter suppression is the use of voter purging that removes eligible voters from the Registrar of Voters roster, effectively removing their access to vote until they are re-registered, possibly with more requirements than they first had. People would face purges over claims of voter inactivity or address changes, which are proven false quickly as many re-registered claiming they never changed addresses or haven't been completely inactive voters. This use it or lose it approach regarding voting was meant to be more of an attempt at compulsory voting, such as in Australia that has a higher voter turnout. The difference is the restrictive nature here inhibits voter turnout instead of actively empowering. This is proved by the record amount of voters purged over the years as Kemp served as state secretary. In July 2017, Brian Kemp purged 560,000 voters in a single day. This number is also not an outsider in comparison to other purges. Rather, it's more of an average. So when the margin of only 55,000 votes out of 4 million gave him the seat as governor, it seemed plausible that Kemp's position gave him the slight advantage needed to win. Purging isn't limited to southern states, though. All states purge voters for a variety of reasons, such as removing deceased voters, but this varies state to state, and that is where the problem lies. The history of voting in America has a long and dark past that has led many current citizens to feel that they have been failed as politicians bend the rules in their favor to be more for their political careers. Along with the use of misinformation, they confuse working class Americans on the legislation that would actually be beneficial to voters and in turn hold politicians accountable by actually voting. Some examples of simple legislation that could benefit voters would be requesting a national holiday to vote, or also switching the actual voting day from a Tuesday to a weekend. That is the end of my project. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, I'll be taking them now.